Hello and welcome to Study History with Mr. P. In this video I'm going to look at crime, punishment and law enforcement in Anglo-Saxon England. So during the period of Anglo-Saxon England there are three important trends in crime and punishment that we should know about. The first is that the power and influence of the king over crime and punishment grew. So increasingly penalties for crimes were decided by the king. The role of the Christian church also increased, and the use of punishment, including capital punishments, increased to boost the king's power and authority. So let's look at how these aspects played out in Anglo-Saxon England. So first of all, the role of Anglo-Saxon kings was very important. So from around the year 1000 AD, King Ethelred II had more control over the whole of England, and he could enforce laws for the whole country. Before this time, communities had made their own laws. An Anglo-Saxon society was structured into tiers. With the king at the top, who ruled the country, he decided the laws and the codes of law and kept the king's peace, which meant keeping law and order. There were then the nobles, who were given land by the king. They were wealthy and powerful. They could advise the king on making laws, on appointing shire reeves to make sure people followed the law, and were responsible for keeping the king's peace in their local area. There were then free men who rented and owned pieces of land, but had no say in lawmaking, and the vast majority of people were peasants or serfs who owned no land and worked for others for little or no pay, and again they had no say in making the law. Any actions that threatened this structure were classed as crimes and were known as crimes against authority. So what constituted crime in Anglo-Saxon England? Well, as towns began to grow in importance and size, there became more opportunities to commit crimes against a person and crimes against property. But most people in this time did still live in villages, and local communities were expected to take collective responsibility for upholding the law. The church itself had a responsibility for stopping moral crimes and for stopping crimes against the church. But how were crimes stopped and how was the law enforced? Well, whether crimes were seen as minor or serious offences was based upon Anglo-Saxon ideas about justice and about how society should be organised. Anglo-Saxons believed it was the victim's responsibility to seek justice if a crime was committed, that the role of the local community in policing and the behaviour of others in delivering justice was very important, that anybody who witnessed a crime should raise the hue and cry, so literally shouting for help, and those who heard it had a duty to help chase and catch the suspect. God, in many instances, was seen as the final judge of innocence or of guilt, and oaths, so promises, played an important role in proving a person's innocence. The status and position of different groups was made clear by the law, and if there wasn't enough innocence to prove guilt, then a person could be tried in church courts in something known as trial by ordeal. These included trials by hot iron, hot water or cold water, and were used for God to judge someone's innocence or guilt, simply by seeing whether the person survived or recovered quickly enough from the trial. And if they did, they were innocent. If they didn't, they were guilty. Now, punishments were varied in Anglo-Saxon times. Murder, believe it or not, was sometimes punished with a fine paid directly to the victim's family, known as the wergild. This was intended to stop or reduce something called blood feuds. Now, blood feuds were where members of a victim's family killed the murderer, as was their right, whose family then killed his murderer, who in return exacted revenge, and so this spiral went on and on, which is why the wergild was introduced. Some crimes were punishable by capital punishment, so death penalty or corporal punishment, which meant causing harm or pain to the body. These were a form of both retribution and deterrent. Now remember, retribution means someone has paid for their crimes, have been made to pay either financially or by suffering for their crime. And a deterrent is obviously something that puts somebody off from committing a crime. The crimes of treason and arson were punished by execution. And there were a range of corporal punishments that included mutilation, that was used for lesser crimes and was also meant to act as a deterrent, as I mentioned before. There were also public punishments, so using the stocks and the pillory that combined pain and discomfort with public humiliation. And we need to remember that some of these crimes overlapped in their purpose. So while some people may have seen it as retribution, others may have viewed it as a deterrent, or a combination of both.